So before I get into the prelims, I just wanted to note quickly that Vicente Luque, in fact, lost his last fight but won the four previous to that against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who is obviously one of the best fighters in the welterweight division, has fought Woodley multiple times for the belt. Luque, I believe, has 3 losses in the UFC, one against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, one against Leon Edwards. The third one I'm forgetting was early in his career, just after he had been on The Ultimate Fighter. But again, Leon Edwards and Wonderboy are, I think most people would say, definitely top 7 in the welterweight division, showing how durable Luque is. Moving on to the preliminary fights, the first fight will be Ronaldo Jacare Souza against Uriah Hall. And Uriah Hall is, frankly, one of the best counter-strikers at 185. He's basically fought a lot of tough fighters. He's had some tough results, but he's starting to climb his way up at the middleweight division. And Jacare, kind of, as he's bounced back and forth between 205 and 185, he's looking to put his stamp on this card. I think Jacare's best bet, if he were to win this fight, would be to get the fight on the ground and start to work with Uriah Hall and try and get a submission, as I think he's clearly superior in terms of his BJJ skills. Now, Uriah Hall, his bet is going to be to try and wrestle, grapple, keep the fight on the feet, because I think Jacare is going to try and press forward, stay very aggressive, maybe, again, mix in some punches. Jacare is no joke of a striker either. He obviously had a tough result. I believe his last fight was at 205 against Jan Blachowicz. So again, Jan Blachowicz is going to be fighting for the title against John Jones at 205. Jacare is a very big guy for 185. But I do think Uriah Hall is going to be able to outstrike Jacare, and I think it's going to be too much for Jacare. I have Uriah Hall winning this fight. Uriah Hall is also a little bit longer than Jacare. Jacare, not only a little bit, but quite a bit longer. He's got a 7.5-inch reach advantage, and they're basically the same height. In fact, Jacare is actually 1 inch taller than Uriah Hall, so this is quite a long guy. This is kind of why he has a long reach. This is going to help him in his counter striking, so I have to go with Uriah Hall. I think he's going to gain some momentum and kind of be a guy that we see, in the top 6 or potentially even in the top 5 at 185 eventually in his career. Because, again, like I said, he's a tremendous fighter. He's got a tremendous spinning kick finish in The Ultimate Fighter. I forget who he was fighting, but that was a tremendous finish. And he likes to keep the pace going forward. I don't see him sitting back in this fight. I see him winning this fight, though. So that's the first fight on the preliminary card. The next fight is Carla Esparza versus Michelle Waterson. And both of these women have had kind of a tough go in the UFC. Both have had pretty high expectations at the strawweight at 115, and they haven't really been able to do much. Michelle Waterson obviously coming off a defeat against Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I just wanted to note that when I saw Joanna Jędrzejczyk fight Michelle Waterson in her only fight before facing Zhang Weili for the 115 belt, the strawweight belt, I did not think Joanna was going to go into that fight against Zhang Weili and do as much damage as she did. In fact, people thought she won that fight. I didn't think she won that fight, but it's as close as a needle. It was a very close fight, and I should say the thinness of a needle. But I think that Michelle Waterson showed clearly a bit of skill in that fight, because I didn't think Joanna fought very well against Michelle Waterson. But Joanna Jędrzejczyk, former UFC champion, she's still probably the second best or third best fighter in the strawweight division. She's a multiple-time Muay Thai world champion. And I think this was a tough test for Michelle Waterson. I think Michelle Waterson spoke about that loss and saying that she had learned some things from that fight. But Carla is no joke either. She works very well on the ground. I honestly, this is one of probably the toughest fights on the card for me to pick. I would probably have to say Carla just because she's superior in grappling. She's superior on the ground. And I think that it's kind of a coming out party for Carla. I don't know if Michelle Waterson, this is just in my opinion a very bad matchup for her. I don't think this fight's gonna be a stand-up where she's gonna be able to strike and kind of do her thing and land power. I think Carla's gonna take this fight to the ground and kind of control. So that's how I see that fight playing out. And the last fight on, there's two more fights on the prelims. There's basically a co-main on the prelims. And the first of those fights is Fabricio Werdum versus Alexei Oleinik. And Fabricio Werdum is, frankly, he's a former UFC champion. He might be one of the best all-around fighters in the UFC, and some people might react crazy to that, but we're talking about a guy very underrated striking. He can throw bombs, and he's extremely accurate with his striking for a guy at that weight that is so good in terms of his BJJ skills. I believe he's a black belt in BJJ, and he's a pretty damn good grappler. So is Alexei Oleinik. Again, Alexei Oleinik is a great grappler. Is his striking as good as Fabricio Werdum? No. Fabricio Werdum can throw deadly kicks, deadly punches. I've seen him knock out with the overhand right punch. He's got a lot of power. He's very good on the ground, and I think Alexei Oleinik's best bet is to submit Fabricio on the ground. I think that's the only way he can win this fight. I see Fabricio Werdum winning this fight multiple ways. And generally how I want to break down fights, or how I predict fights, is I look at the amount of ways somebody can end a fight. And if their opponent is not any better than them, or doesn't have any more ways of ending the fight, that makes it very difficult to pick the other person. Oleinik is also older, and he's been fighting a lot. I just don't see this fight working out for him. As good of a fighter he is, I think Fabricio Werdum this is going to be his big comeback fight. He hasn't fought, I want to say, in at least 2 years. And again, former UFC champion. So I don't see this panning out for Oleinik at the heavyweight division. I have Fabricio Werdum winning that fight. And the last fight, the main event of the preliminary card, is Donald Cowboy Cerrone versus Anthony Pettis. Now, both of these gentlemen are coming off back-to-back losses. Showtime, Pettis is coming off losses to Tony Ferguson and to Nate Diaz. The Nate Diaz fight wasn't very good for him. It was almost just like Nate Diaz controlled that entire fight, which is kind of surprising considering we're talking about Showtime. Pettis, a great 155er, a guy that, has held the belt at 155, going up against Donald Cerrone. I'm not going to discredit Donald Cerrone at all. I want to say he's coming off 3 losses in a row. McGregor, Tony Ferguson being 2 of those losses. And, those are 2 of the top 4 or 5 fighters, like, minimum at 155. Connor's held the belt. Tony's held an interim belt. I don't really think there's much argument for that. Personally, I would probably have them in the top 3, but just to make it, kind of an undeniable claim that they're both top 5 at 155. But I think we've seen Cowboy's fighting diminish. This is no insult to Cowboy. He's one of the greatest UFC fighters that's never held a belt, whether that's at 155 or at 170. Now, this fight, an interesting part about this fight, it's taking place in welterweight. It's a 170 fight. I think this is a big-time advantage for Pettis. I think he's going to be bigger in that weight class. And again, fairly similar reach, fairly similar height. Cowboy does have a 3-inch height advantage over Showtime Pettis, but only has a half-inch reach advantage. That's why I say that I don't think height's going to play a big part of this fight. Now, they've fought before. Pettis won that first fight. One interesting thing to note is that Pettis is able to switch stances, but he's very good in the southpaw stance. And I've heard that Donald Cerrone hasn't fared well against southpaw fighters. Obviously, Conor McGregor is one of those who's mainly a southpaw fighter, and I just don't see Cowboy being able to do very well. Pettis likes to take shots, to the chest, or not take shots to the chest, but dish out shots to the chest. And I don't know if Cowboy's going to be able to handle some of those shots because he's very aggressive in his work to the body as Pettis. I see this kind of as kind of, one of a few last fights for Cowboy. I don't see a resurrection of Cowboy. Do I want to see a resurrection of Cowboy? 100%. He's not only one of my favorite dudes in the UFC, but he's just a great fighter. He's a tough dude. And as much as I hope both of these guys win this fight, I just think Pettis has put on a pretty good performance against Tony Ferguson before he broke his hand in the second round. And then he came up against a very tough fighter at 155 in Diego Ferreira. And Diego is I want to say he's like 6-0 in his last fights, in his last 6 fights. And he's frankly probably the best guy in terms of BJJ at 155. So Pettis had a very tough matchup, and Pettis wasn't really able to keep the fight on his feet. Diego was able to take him down. So, again, just a tough matchup for Pettis. I think this is a much better matchup for Pettis. But as much as I think Pettis is going to win, I'm pretty confident in that pick in terms of the last 7 fights that I predicted so far. I think that Cowboy is still a great fighter, and I'm not going to deny how great he is. Certainly not going to deny, his performance against McGregor. He wasn't able to put it together. But again, McGregor came out with an onslaught of just punches, elbows, kicks. His striking was flawless. I mean, there's no argument against that. But I don't think that was really the true Cowboy. Cowboy's come out and said that. That Donald might have been there, but Cowboy wasn't. So I do have Pettis in this fight. But I think this is going to be a great fight. I see this probably going towards a second round, probably first or second round knockout from Pettis. Whether that's just through his punches to the Donald Cerrone's gut and liver. I see it kind of ending that way. Donald can win this fight. It's going to come down to him being in tip-top shape in the third round. Just in case I didn't know it already, I see Fabricio Verdum via submission, probably in the first or second round. I see Carla, again, via submission, probably in the first or second round as well. If not, that fight probably go to a decision. I see it ending either early via submission or a decision in that fight. And in terms of the Uriah Hall fight, I probably see that as a knockout in the second round. But again, it'll be interesting to see if Jacare can get that control. That's how I see Jacare winning the fight, is trying to control the rounds, take it to the ground, and get a decision. But anyways, let me know what you think of these picks. I think that this is a very tough card to predict the fights. Dana has done a great job, as well as Sean Shelby and other matchmakers involved in putting this card together and putting some pretty close fights that are going to be tough for the bookies that have been tough for the bookies to make the odds for, and are going to be tough for fans to bet on. So let me know what you think about my picks, and hopefully join me for the main card fight breakdown. Thank you.